Ladies and gentlemen, via Zoom in Adelaide, please welcome the current chair of Beyond Blue and former Prime Minister, the Honourable Julia Gillard AC.
Good evening, and thank you, Robin, for that generous introduction. I start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands you are gathering on today, the Ngunnawal people, and in a spirit of reconciliation, I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It is a great honour to give this oration, and I extend my heartfelt thanks to Mental Health Australia for the invitation. I'm really disappointed that I'm unable to do what I had hoped for and join you in person tonight. As we all know, in the age of COVID, travel is complicated. Like so many others, my plans have been disrupted by COVID uncertainties, border restrictions, and the limited number of current flight options. I am very grateful that I will be home for Christmas with my loved ones, but deeply regretful I'm missing out on being in a room with you to honour a truly inspirational Australian, Grace Groom. I didn't have the pleasure of meeting Grace, but many speak warmly of her great character, integrity and passion. A pioneer with an unwavering commitment to mental health reform, her legacy is one that endures and inspires. Dr. Grace Groom fought for a world where people living with mental ill health are afforded dignity, compassion and equity of access to treatment. She brought the stories of those who interacted with Australia's crumbling mental health system out of the darkness and demanded we not look the other way. But she also ensured we recognise the indomitable spirit that humans have, seeing beyond labels to show how people can flourish if given the opportunity to reach their full potential. I acknowledge Grace Groom's family who are joining us tonight and know that they, above all others, miss Grace and honour her achievements. As a result of Grace's efforts and those of many other reformers, we've come a long way since the days when mental illness was treated like a shameful secret, but there is still a long way to go. The system remains fragmented, chronically underfunded, and not fit for purpose. Getting timely, appropriate care can be a lottery that is too often predicated on your bank balance, postcode, or background. These inequities have been exposed and amplified during the pandemic as fault lines in our society. Just as the impacts of mental health and suicidality are not felt equally, the impacts of the COVID crisis have been unevenly distributed. People in insecure work and housing, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, LGBTIQ+ Australians, young people, those from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, or living with disabilities or pre-existing mental health conditions have been disproportionately affected. Women have also been heavily impacted, and that's what I want to talk about tonight, because we already know that gender plays a role in mental health outcomes. Men die by suicide at greater rates than women. Women self-harm and attempt suicide at higher rates than men, and transgender and non-binary Australians at even higher rates. Gender matters, and during the COVID crisis, it's been a significant factor. We've seen the disadvantage women face become more entrenched, but history tells us these moments of disruption are often dividing lines. When we look back, we see a clear distinction between the way we lived before and how we emerged on the other side. As the UN Working Group on Discrimination Against Women and Girls has said, the COVID-19 crisis is an opportunity to address structural inequalities and deficits that have consistently held women back and to reimagine and transform systems and societies. Tonight, I will draw on the continuing threads of my own public life, education, women's leadership and mental health as key areas to help create a fairer future where everyone can flourish. But before we look to the future, I want to share some lessons on equality from my own childhood to explain the origin of the values and priorities that drove me throughout my public life and which drive me still. My family migrated to Australia from Wales when I was 4 and my sister Alison was 7. As a baby, I had bronchial pneumonia, and doctors told my parents I would struggle in Welsh winters. Dad believed Australia would offer greater economic opportunities and a better start for me and my older sister. But things originally didn't turn out as he'd planned. We arrived in 1966 in the middle of a drought and a sluggish economy. Dad found it really hard to get a job, and those experiences left an indelible mark. He never forgot banging on doors, looking for work, and the spirit-crushing rejections. I quickly learned that work gives life direction and purpose, and that loss of employment can create corrosive aimlessness, chipping away at a person's sense of self. My parents also taught me that education is to be valued and is a key foundation stone for life. Mum's ill health as a child cost her a good education. And Dad, despite doing well at school, left at 14 because his family needed him to be earning. My parents made successes of their lives, but felt the loss of their educational opportunities keenly and impressed upon us a thirst for knowledge. Mum taught us to read before we started school. Although I was too young to give it a name, I sensed the clear link between inequality and access to good education, to doing well at school. I noticed the students with challenging home lives who failed a grade in primary school, and the newly arrived Greek children who struggled to keep up in class because English was not their first language. It instilled in me the belief that every child deserves a quality education and every person deserves the dignity of work. I also grew up in a family that talked about mental health because my father ultimately became a psychiatric nurse at Glenside Hospital in Adelaide, a job he excelled at for more than 2 decades. When it first opened in 1846, Glenside was a foreboding building where people living with mental illness were treated like criminals. I remember Dad telling me he was once looking for something at the back of a cupboard in an older part of the hospital and found a pair of thumb screws. Dad always treated the people who lived at Glenside with empathy and humanity, and over time the institution did too. At Glenside, the locks went and care became more compassionate. But my father was acutely aware that the wave of deinstitutionalisation, which has so many merits, wasn't systematically replaced by new community-based, individualised assistance. It risked leaving people alone and unsupported. He knew, and I came to understand, that there was so much more to do. I took these beliefs into politics because I know all these strands in a person's life, work, education, a stable home, the best possible mental health, these things are all connected. Giving people the best start gives them the greatest chance to lead a contributing life. These early lessons became a foundation for my time with the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, which works in the 70 poorest countries in the world. GPE is striving to ensure every child has access to a quality school education with a particular focus on girls. Why? Because girls are most likely to miss out on an education, and because educated girls help lift their families out of poverty. As an active and committed feminist throughout my political life, I want to see advances in gender equality across the spectrum, from ensuring every girl has access to education right through to how many women are sitting in parliaments. I direct that energy to my work at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London, and now at the Australian National University. Gender inequality was a persistent feature of our society before COVID, and the impact of the pandemic has exacerbated it through what the Grattan Institute report released earlier this year described as the triple whammy suffered by women in last year's recession. Women were more likely to lose jobs, to get unpaid work increased, and to get less government support. At the peak of the crisis, women lost jobs at double the rate of men, almost 8% compared to 4%. and they shouldered the increase in unpaid work, including supervising children learning from home and taking on an average of an extra hour each day on top of their existing heavy load. Mothers in couples and single parents, 80% of whom are women, were more likely to leave the labour force than other groups. Women of childbearing age were also forced to give up study in record numbers. These structural inequalities compound women's lifetime economic disadvantage. 6 months out of work can add another $100,000 to the $2 million average lifetime earnings gap between men and women. As Australia contemplates a life beyond COVID, we must seize the moment to create a more equal playing field. Access to quality education and gender equality are not only significant issues in their own right, these are also key social drivers that influence our mental health. Applying a social determinant lens is at the centre of our work in the mental health sector. The COVID crisis has underscored that without secure work, a safe place to call home, social connection, access to childcare and education, people quickly start to struggle, and those who are already disadvantaged struggle the most. The greater burden women carried through the pandemic meant they reported higher levels of anxiety, depression, distress, and self-harm. There was also a troubling spike in the number of teenage girls and young women presenting to hospital with self-harm injuries. This tallies with research released in August from Monash University Centre for Health Economics, which found that during economic downturns, women in their 20s were most likely to suffer poor mental health. We need to think differently in the future if we are to reduce the disproportionate mental health burden women face. And of course, we must also acknowledge the toll placed on men who are overrepresented in the suicide statistics, and we must build a system that works for everyone. Right now, Australia is at a reform crossroads. Wholesale structural change to our mental health and suicide prevention systems is long overdue and has never been more urgently required. But we must get reform right. This is our opportunity to come together, governments, the sector and the community, with a laser focus on the social inequities that drive poor mental health. Creating a compassionate, person-centred system where we listen to people's lived experience and put it at the heart of the decision-making process will remove some structural barriers. We must see the whole person and address their unique life circumstances. That means not just a health response, but a wraparound, whole of government approach with education, justice, housing and employment, all vital pieces in this puzzle. We must invest in programs to support women's mental health, particularly for those in insecure employment and housing and who face intergenerational trauma. And we need a commitment for long-term funding so that mental health reform is not dictated by election cycles. One joined-up ecosystem, not a piecemeal approach that stitches together time-limited investments and projects which are not interconnected. We could realise this vision of the future if every Australian government, state and federal, comes together before the end of this year to jointly author a bold national mental health and suicide prevention agreement. And while we are imagining courageous intergovernmental reform, let's also contemplate a joined-up approach to improving gender equality with a national goal of lifting us from the doldrums of number 50 in the international rankings to the top 10. After all, if New Zealand can do it, so can we. I want to see an Australia where we achieve true equality and women leaders are everywhere. And I believe we have reason for optimism on that front. I see the trailblazing spirit of Grace Groom alive and well in young women like Brittany Higgins, Grace Tame, and Janelle Contos, who are bravely challenging the status quo. The ability of these women to take constructive action in response to life-changing events and challenges has me both awestruck and inspired. Brittany Higgins has not let loud and powerful voices in our community silence her. Indeed, she has become a formidable force who I know will drive reform and push national conversations regardless of how difficult the issue. I was thrilled when Brittany joined the team at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at ANU. Our evidence-based research and advocacy supporting women's leadership and improving workplace gender equality will greatly benefit from her perspective and experience. Chanel's petition for earlier sex education in schools on consent, which led to disclosures of sexual assault from schoolgirls all over Australia, shows the power of resilience in the female collective. I spent time with Chanel in London, where she's currently studying, and I was delighted when she came to a dinner for my 60th birthday. Inevitably, at a birthday event, there was much talk of ageing, and in the course of that, I asked Chanel when she was born, and whilst it was sobering for someone born in 1961 to hear her say 1998, it struck me as wonderful that feminist activism and connection spans the generations. These young women are harnessing this moment of social disruption with a more impatient brand of feminism that grabs change with both hands. We will only achieve gender equality if more women step into public life and shake things up, and men stand alongside us as firm allies. That might seem a counterintuitive wish, given my experience in politics. I know some of you have watched the documentary Strong Female Lead about my time as Prime Minister, but my experiences, whilst played out on the most public stage, are not unique. They are emblematic of a broader problem every woman in Australia has faced, in her workplace, at home, in education, just in day-to-day life. My story struck a chord because every woman has felt the sting of being demeaned, undermined, or overlooked. But I want to assure you all that my experiences have not bred disillusionment or resentment. They've only strengthened my resolve to make the path easier for tomorrow's female leaders. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it and change the future. Indeed, times of adversity offer us a chance to grow and build resilience. And that's where we find ourselves as a nation after this period of great trauma. You would all be familiar with the notion of post-traumatic stress, but there is also a lesser known phenomenon when people have been through disruptive times, and that is post-traumatic growth. These moments that set us back on our heels also give us pause to reassess how we're living and what's truly important. We're all having those deep reflections at an individual level and a society as we finally, ultimately emerge from this period of turbulence, which of course is still with us, but at some point will come to an end. We do have an opportunity to use this collective contemplation to fix the structural problems that have for too long driven inequality. If we get the settings right, we can redesign the mental health system, putting in place social guardrails that remove inequities and help people be well and stay well. When I look to the road ahead, I think of Grace Groom's legacy of compassion, innovation, and determination. She was one of the original disruptors, a woman who challenged conventional thinking. That is what I see in the next generation of women demanding profound change in our nation. But we need everyone to come on the journey. Gender equality does not only benefit women, it empowers every person to live free from the suffocating constraints of gender stereotypes. We need men to be part of the solution because power disproportionately remains in their hands. I would ask any men listening tonight to reflect on how you can use that power for change. And I urge policymakers and sector leaders to think of all of the layers of societal inequality that have been exposed and exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis. We cannot squander this opportunity for reform. We need to seize it as a defining moment to reshape our nation's future by tackling the root causes of disadvantage. We must channel the energy and commitment of Grace Groom and the pioneering women who have followed her. If we advance with courage and conviction, change is within our grasp. I thank you for the opportunity to speak with you tonight.